Imagine this. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Time. Washington is fast asleep. Yet halfway across the world, Mark Carney stands at a podium in Ottawa, making an announcement that would reshape the global economy. This wasn't a mere framework, no vague memorandum of understanding, no statement of intent that could be easily walked back, renegotiated, or quietly shelved when the political moment passed. This was a binding, comprehensive, fully executed $560 billion economic partnership, signed simultaneously in 6 capitals, involving 6 nations representing over $25 trillion in combined GDP. It completely restructured energy, technology, defense procurement, critical mineral supply chains, and financial settlement mechanisms across 3 continents. The deal was done, signed, and announced before the first senior White House official even woke up, checked their phone, and discovered that the world had fundamentally changed overnight. This wasn't an accident. 3 a.m. in Washington meant 9 a.m. in Berlin, 4 p.m. in Tokyo, 5 p.m. in Canberra, 9 a.m. in London, and 10 a.m. in Seoul. Every signatory nation announced the deal during their own business hours, within their own news cycles, in front of their own press corps, their own markets, and their own citizens, while the one nation that would have moved heaven and earth to stop it lay utterly unconscious. By the time the National Security Advisor's phone rang at 6:14 a.m., the ink had been dry for over 3 hours. Before the first emergency meeting convened in the White House Situation Room at 7:45, markets in Frankfurt, London, Tokyo, Seoul, and Sydney were already open, already pricing in this new reality. By the time the President of the United States was briefed on the deal's contents at 8:30, $560 billion worth of economic architecture had been constructed around the United States, not against it, not in retaliation for anything, simply around it, and there was nothing left to prevent, counter, lobby, threaten, or undo. It's a scenario Warren Buffett described as something he'd witnessed countless times in business over 70 years, but never on the scale of sovereign nations. He described it as the moment a group of companies, fed up with a dominant player, quietly builds an entire alternative ecosystem while that player is focused elsewhere. But it was Mark Carney's words at that 3 a.m. press conference, 9 words spoken into a camera aimed squarely at a sleeping capital, that will truly define this historical moment. Stick around, because when you hear what's actually in this deal, how it was negotiated in complete secrecy from American intelligence, why the 3 a.m. timing was a strategic weapon and not a coincidence, what Washington tried to do when it woke up, and why every option had already been closed, and what Buffett says this means for American economic centrality for the next 50 years, you'll understand why this isn't just a trade deal. This is the world announcing it has learned to function without the United States, and it learned it overnight. Hit subscribe, because the rollout is already underway, and American industries are just now realizing they've been replaced. Let me walk you through the details of this deal, because $560 billion is a number so large it becomes abstract unless you understand what it represents. And what it represents is a complete economic architecture designed to make American participation in the global economy optional rather than essential. The energy provisions alone total $210 billion over 15 years. Canada committed long-term liquefied natural gas supply contracts to Germany, Japan, and South Korea at volumes that collectively replace not just Russian energy dependence, which Europe has been struggling to address since 2022, but American energy dependence too. 3 new Canadian LNG export terminals, financed by a consortium of German and Japanese industrial capital, will be operational within 4 years. Their combined output will dwarf America's current export capacity to the European and Asian markets. Australia mirrored this with parallel natural gas and hydrogen supply agreements, creating a vital secondary energy corridor for Asian signatories. The design here is brilliant, deliberate redundancy. No single supplier is dominant, no single choke point exists, and critically, no signatory depends on any nation outside the agreement for more than 20% of its primary energy supply. The United States, which had confidently positioned itself as Europe's and Asia's go-to alternative energy supplier since the Russian disruption, has just been structurally excluded from a market it assumed was its for the taking. The critical minerals and technology provisions total $170 billion and represent what Pentagon analysts later called the most significant shift in Allied industrial capacity since the Marshall Plan. Canada, Australia, and South Korea, collectively holding some of the world's largest reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, and refined silicon, committed to a sweeping joint minerals processing and semiconductor manufacturing program. This creates a seamless supply chain from raw extraction to finished component, entirely outside American jurisdiction and export control authority. 14 new processing facilities across 3 countries. 6 semiconductor fabrication plants producing the 14 to 28 nanometer chips that power automobiles, medical devices, industrial equipment, military hardware, and critical infrastructure. A shared rare earth processing capability that shatters current reliance on Chinese refining without routing the alternative through American-controlled channels. The technology architecture has a defining characteristic that American trade officials recognized immediately, and with alarm. It operates completely beyond the reach of American export controls, sanctions regimes, and technology transfer restrictions. For the first time ever, a major allied industrial base can produce, process, and distribute critical technologies without needing American permission, American components, or American oversight. The defense procurement provisions total $90 billion and address something that NATO planners have been discussing privately for years, but never had the institutional framework to implement. Joint weapons procurement among allied nations, specifically designed to reduce dependence on American defense contractors. The agreement establishes shared procurement protocols for naval vessels, armored vehicles, communication systems, and surveillance platforms manufactured by German, Japanese, South Korean, Australian, and Canadian defense industries. It doesn't outright exclude American products, rather it creates a robust, competitive alternative that allows signatory nations to choose non-American suppliers without the procurement delays, technology transfer restrictions, and political conditions that have historically accompanied American arms sales. A Japanese defense official, whose comments were later shared with the media, put it perfectly. "We are not leaving the American defense umbrella. We are ensuring that if the umbrella develops holes, we have our own." The financial provisions were the elements nobody in Washington saw coming, and they sparked the most immediate market reaction. The deal establishes a multilateral currency settlement mechanism, essentially a system for signatories to conduct trade in their own currencies, bypassing the US dollar entirely for a defined set of bilateral and multilateral transactions. This mechanism won't replace the dollar as a global reserve currency. It won't challenge the dollar's role in broader international finance. But what it does do is create a parallel settlement infrastructure, allowing $560 billion in annual trade flows to move between these 6 nations without ever touching the American financial system. The true significance isn't the volume. $560 billion is a fraction of global dollar-denominated trade. The significance is the precedent. For the first time, a group of major allied democracies has built a trade settlement system specifically designed to operate independently of America's financial architecture. The dollar's role in this specific corridor of global trade just shifted from essential to optional. And as every currency trader instantly understood, optional is the first step toward unnecessary. Now, how in the world was a $560 billion deal involving 6 sovereign nations negotiated, drafted, reviewed, approved by 6 separate governments, and signed without the most powerful intelligence apparatus on Earth ever detecting it? Because the secrecy itself is a strategic statement, just as significant as the deal's contents. The negotiations unfolded over 11 months, utilizing a communication and logistics protocol specifically engineered with input from signals intelligence professionals from at least 3 signatory nations, designed to evade American surveillance. Diplomatic communications were routed through encrypted channels that completely bypassed the Five Eyes intelligence network. In-person meetings were discreetly held in countries outside American intelligence sharing arrangements: Switzerland, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, Iceland, using commercial cover stories and scheduling that mimicked routine bilateral consultations rather than multilateral negotiations. Delegation sizes were tiny, never more than 8 officials per country per meeting, to avoid the logistical footprint that large diplomatic gatherings produce and that intelligence agencies monitor. Documents were never transmitted electronically between capitals. Physical drafts were carried by diplomatic couriers using sealed pouches, shielded by Vienna Convention diplomatic immunity. The final signing ceremony was a marvel of coordination, conducted by secure phone call between 6 leaders at a prearranged time, each leader in their own capital, each signing their nation's copy of the agreement simultaneously, each announcing to their own media at the exact same moment. This American intelligence failure is being described by former officials as one of the most profound in the post-Cold War era, not because of its military implications, but because of what it starkly reveals about the erosion of trust within the Western alliance. 5 of the 6 signatory nations are members of intelligence sharing arrangements with the United States. 3 are members of Five Eyes, the most intimate signals intelligence partnership in the world. Canada itself is a Five Eyes founding member. The fact that these nations forged a $500 billion economic agreement using protocols specifically designed to outwit the very intelligence networks they share with America is more than an operational achievement. It's a declaration. The United States is no longer trusted with advanced knowledge of Allied economic planning. Why? Because that knowledge would have been used not to participate, but to prevent. As one former CIA deputy director remarked on a cable news panel the morning the deal broke, our closest allies just treated us the way we treat adversaries. They concealed their strategic planning from our intelligence capabilities. That is not a trade story. That is a trust story. And the trust story, he added, is far, far worse. And then Washington woke up. The mere 3 hours between that first phone call and the first press conference revealed just how thoroughly the deal had sealed every American option before America even knew those options existed. The National Security Advisor, roused by a State Department watch officer at 6:14 a.m., initially reacted with sheer disbelief. He repeatedly questioned the report's veracity, its potential as disinformation, the exaggeration of its scale. It had been verified. It was not disinformation. And the scale, if anything, had been understated in the initial reporting. By 6:45, the Secretaries of State, Treasury, Commerce, and Defense were all awake and briefed. At 7:15, calls went out to signatory capitals. American ambassadors in Berlin, Tokyo, Canberra, Seoul, London, and Ottawa were instructed to request emergency meetings with their host governments. The response was universally the same. The agreement has been signed. We are happy to discuss its contents at your convenience. Not a negotiation, not an apology, a simple notification. The deal was done. The conversation was now about implementation, not permission. President Trump was briefed at 8:30 a.m. His reaction, according to 4 officials present, cycled through 3 distinct phases in approximately 12 minutes. Phase 1. Denial. This can't be real. There's no way they did this without us knowing. He demanded previous intelligence briefings from the past week, convinced something had been missed, a signal ignored, a system failed. But the briefings were empty. No mention of the deal, no signals, no intercepts, no diplomatic reporting, no satellite imagery of unusual activity, nothing. 6 allied nations had negotiated a $500 billion agreement for 11 months and produced 0 detectable intelligence signatures. The Director of National Intelligence was summoned and arrived at 9:15. His assessment was 2 sentences long, landing in the Oval Office like a concussion. Our allies used counterintelligence protocols against us that we developed for use against adversaries. They succeeded. Phase 2. Rage. Directed at everyone and everything. The intelligence community for failing to detect the negotiations, the State Department for failing to anticipate the deal, the National Security Advisor for failing to provide warning, the ambassadors in signatory capitals for failing to report anything unusual, and at Carney personally for what Trump branded the most underhanded thing any leader has ever done. His language, 3 officials noted, was beyond anything we'd heard, even from him. He demanded a list of every American official who had been in contact with signatory governments in the past year, convinced someone on the American side had to have known. No one had. The rage was palpable, but it was compounded by something many officials considered even worse than anger: humiliation. The world's most powerful leader had been rendered utterly irrelevant to the century's most consequential economic agreement. And the proof of that irrelevance was painfully simple. He had been asleep when it happened, and nobody had thought to wake him. Phase 3. Retaliation. This was the phase that most worried officials, a demand for immediate, maximal retaliatory options, delivered with a tone beyond strategic calculation. He wanted simultaneous, immediate, maximal tariffs on all 6 signatory nations, sanctions on entities involved in the deal, the ambassadors of all 6 nations summoned to the State Department, a public statement calling the deal an act of economic warfare against the United States. Every single option was assessed within the hour by a hastily assembled interagency team, and every single one was deemed either ineffective, counterproductive, or both. Tariffs on 6 nations simultaneously would cripple over 60% of American trade, sparking immediate, pre-built retaliatory packages from nations that, as the previous months had demonstrated, had ready responses for deployment. Sanctions on allied economic entities would trigger reciprocal actions that would isolate American companies from allied markets in which they currently generate over $2 trillion in annual revenue. Summoning 6 ambassadors would produce 6 identical, unyielding responses. The deal is signed. We are happy to discuss it. The retaliatory toolkit America had wielded for 2 years, threats, tariffs, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, was designed for bilateral conflicts. It had no setting for 6 simultaneous allied adversaries who had coordinated their defenses before the attack could even be launched. The White House wasn't just outmaneuvered, it was outclassed. And the difference between those 2 things is the difference between losing a game and discovering you were never even playing the same game. Mark Carney's 3 a.m. press conference had been orchestrated with the same surgical precision as the deal itself. He spoke for 11 minutes, outlining the deal's provisions in summary. He named the signatory nations. He described the implementation timeline. Then, at the very end, he looked directly into the camera, knowing his true audience was asleep, knowing they would see this recording in the morning, knowing the very gap between his speaking and their hearing was the message. And he uttered them. The world doesn't stop because Washington is sleeping. 9 words delivered at 3 o'clock in the morning to an unconscious capital. The double meaning was immediate and utterly unmistakable. Literally, the deal was signed while Washington slept. Figuratively, the world is moving forward, whether the United States participates or not. That sentence blazed across the front page of every major newspaper by noon Eastern Time. It was quoted in 14 parliamentary sessions across the signatory nations. It was cited in 3 separate Wall Street analyst notes as undeniable evidence of a fundamental shift in the assumption of American economic centrality. 9 words that declared, "You are no longer the center, and we no longer need you to be." And this is where the story deepens, transforming from a mere trade deal into something that strikes at the foundational assumption of American economic power since 1945. Every previous Canadian action in this crisis, tariffs, energy suspensions, diplomatic severances, summit confrontations, was a direct response to the United States. It was reactive. It implicitly acknowledged American centrality even while opposing American behavior. The message of every previous action was, "We reject what you are doing to us." This $560 billion deal carries a fundamentally different message. It doesn't reject American actions. It doesn't respond to American behavior. It doesn't retaliate against American policy. It simply builds a world in which American behavior, American policy, and American participation are simply not required. The shift is from opposition to irrelevance. And irrelevance, strategically speaking, is categorically more threatening than opposition. A nation that opposes you still needs you. A nation that has built an alternative to you does not. And 6 nations just signed an agreement that makes the United States optional in energy, optional in critical minerals, optional in semiconductor manufacturing, optional in defense procurement, and most alarmingly for Washington, optional in financial settlement. Not excluded, not attacked, just optional. Which means the choice to include America is exactly that, a choice. And choices can be made very differently tomorrow than they were made yesterday. Warren Buffett, with his unparalleled insight, addressed the structural dynamic that no one else in the conversation was willing to name. The difference between being defeated and being made irrelevant, and why irrelevance is the one condition from which recovery is nearly impossible. In 70 years of business, Buffett said, I've watched companies lose to competitors thousands of times. They lose on price, on quality, on innovation, on execution. And in most cases, they recover, because a loss is a signal. It tells you what went wrong. It tells you what to fix. It tells you where the gap is. A loss is painful, but it's information. But irrelevance, he explained, is different. Irrelevance means the market simply stopped caring whether you exist. The customers found alternatives. The supply chains rerouted. The ecosystem rebuilt itself around your absence. And by the time you notice, by the time you wake up, in this case literally, the architecture is in place and there's no gap left for you to fill. He paused, then added, that is what happened overnight. 6 nations didn't defeat the United States. They made the United States optional. And optional is worse than defeated because you can recover from a loss, but you cannot recover from a world that has learned to function without you. He applied it with a specificity that resonated deeply within the business community. I watched this happen to a company I followed closely in the 1990s. They were the dominant supplier in their sector, 60% market share, pricing power, the assumption that nobody could build a viable alternative. They got aggressive with their customers. They raised prices. They imposed restrictive terms. They used their dominance as a weapon, and their customers quietly, over about 18 months, built an alternative supply chain. Cooperative purchasing, shared logistics, joint manufacturing with smaller suppliers. By the time the dominant company realized what had happened, 40% of their revenue had been redirected to a network that didn't include them. They spent 5 years and billions of dollars trying to win back the business. They recovered about half of it. The other half was gone permanently. Because the alternative infrastructure existed now, and it was specifically designed to be better than what the dominant player had offered. Once that infrastructure exists, it doesn't dismantle when you improve your behavior. It persists because it was built to replace you, and it works. He connected it to the specific deal with devastating directness. The $560 billion agreement signed last night is that alternative infrastructure. It covers energy, it covers minerals, it covers semiconductors, it covers defense, it covers financial settlement. It was designed explicitly and comprehensively to allow 6 major economies to conduct over $500 billion in trade without touching the American economic system. You can remove every tariff. You can apologize for every threat. You can offer the most generous trade terms in history, and it will not matter, because the infrastructure that made American participation necessary has been replaced by infrastructure that makes American participation optional. And optional, in economics as in relationships, is the beginning of the end. His closing was delivered with the quiet finality that has made Buffett's simplest statements his most quoted. America spent 80 years making itself indispensable. It spent 2 years making itself intolerable. And last night, while it slept, 6 nations proved that intolerable eventually makes indispensable irrelevant. The economic consequences for the United States began materializing even before the first White House press conference. American LNG exporters watched their European and Asian forward contracts plummet in value overnight, as markets priced in the guaranteed Canadian and Australian supply commitments that made American energy exports structurally redundant in the signatory markets. 3 major American energy companies, whose business plans were built on capturing post-Russian European demand, issued profit warnings before the market opened. Defense contractors who had assumed that Allied procurement would continue flowing through American channels confronted the harsh reality that $90 billion in future Allied weapons spending had just been irrevocably committed to non-American manufacturers. Semiconductor companies that had been lobbying Washington for subsidies while relying on Allied supply chains to fill current demand discovered that those supply chains were being restructured into a closed system operating entirely outside American export control jurisdiction. The currency settlement mechanism, however, produced the most immediate and visceral market reaction. The dollar weakened against every signatory currency within hours of the announcement. Not dramatically, not a crisis-level freefall, but a sustained directional shift that currency traders instantly recognized as structural, not speculative. The mechanism covered only $560 billion in annual trade flows, a fraction of global dollar-denominated commerce. But that fraction was the precedent, and the precedent was what the market was pricing in. If 6 allied democracies could build a non-dollar settlement system for $500 billion in trade, the system could expand. More nations could join. More trade flows could be redirected. The dollar's dominance wasn't threatened by this deal, it was questioned. And in currency markets, the distance between dominant and questioned is measured not in percentages, but in decades of slow, compounding erosion. As one former Federal Reserve governor remarked on financial television, the dollar's reserve status has always rested on 2 pillars: the depth of American financial markets and the assumption that there is no viable alternative. The first pillar remains. The second pillar just developed a crack. And cracks in foundations don't heal, they spread. American domestic politics responded with a particular fury, the kind that emerges when a crisis arrives not as a confrontation to be fought, but as a fate to be absorbed. There was no adversary to rally against. There was no demand to reject. There was no threat to counter. Just a deal, signed, sealed, legally binding, already being implemented, built by 6 allied democracies without American knowledge, American participation, or American permission. The governor of Texas, whose state's energy economy was directly threatened by the deal's LNG provisions, held a press conference and said, "I woke up this morning and discovered that the market my state has been investing billions to capture was signed away to Canada and Australia while we were asleep. I need someone to explain to me how the most powerful country on earth got blindsided by its own allies at 3 o'clock in the morning." A Republican senator from a manufacturing state lamented, "We can't sanction our way out of this. We can't tariff our way out of this. This isn't an attack on the United States. This is the world learning to live without us. And the fact that it happened overnight, while we were literally unconscious, is the most damning detail of all, because it means they didn't even need us to be awake." The business community's reaction was distinct, directed not at the signatory nations, but at the administration whose trade policy had driven the deal into existence. The Business Roundtable held an emergency session and released a statement that was, by the standards of corporate diplomacy, incandescent. American business has been warning this administration for 2 years that economic coercion of allies would produce exactly this outcome: the construction of alternative economic architectures that exclude the United States. That outcome has now materialized on a scale that exceeds our worst-case projections. The responsibility lies entirely with the trade policies that made this agreement necessary. The CEO of a major American semiconductor company, whose supply chain was directly threatened by the deal's technology provisions, said on a conference call with analysts, "My company spent 3 years positioning to be the primary supplier for allied semiconductor needs. As of this morning, that position no longer exists. 6 nations just committed $90 billion to building fabrication capacity that doesn't include us. We will now be competing against infrastructure that was specifically designed to replace us. I want to be very clear with our shareholders about the cause. This is the direct and predictable result of using semiconductor export controls as a geopolitical weapon. Our allies decided they couldn't trust the supply chain as long as it ran through Washington, so they built a new one. And they built it while we were asleep. International reaction extended far beyond the 6 signatory nations. India's Prime Minister issued a statement calling the deal a landmark in the evolution of multilateral economic cooperation, and announcing that India would seek observer status in the agreement's governance framework. A clear signal the world's most populous nation was considering aligning with this new architecture, rather than the American-led one. Brazil's president stated the deal demonstrates that economic sovereignty and multilateral cooperation are not only compatible, but mutually reinforcing. The African Union issued a collective statement expressing interest in the deal's critical minerals provisions, noting that African nations with significant mineral reserves could benefit from the processing infrastructure the agreement was building. The ASEAN economic ministers convened an emergency video conference to discuss the deal's implications for Southeast Asian trade. The deal had been signed by 6 nations. Within 72 hours, over 20 more were publicly expressing interest in participating. The architecture wasn't just built, it was expanding. And every nation that joined it moved one step further from American economic centrality. The 3 a.m. timing itself became a subject of intense analysis that extended beyond the diplomatic context into the realm of strategic communication theory. Analysts at several think tanks independently reached the same conclusion. The timing was a message, as significant as the deal's contents. By announcing at 3 a.m. Eastern Time, Carney ensured 3 things simultaneously. First, every signatory nation could announce during their own business hours, projecting normalcy and sovereignty, rather than dependence on Washington's schedule. Second, the American government had 0 time to respond before the deal was priced into global markets. By the time Washington was operational, the financial reality had already been established. Third, and most devastatingly, the timing communicated that America's awareness was not required. The deal didn't need American attention to become real. It didn't need American reaction to take effect. It didn't need the American president to be briefed for the signatures to be valid. The 3 a.m. timing said, "You are not a participant in this process. You are an observer, and observers don't need to be awake." So, here we stand. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Time, while Washington slept, Mark Carney announced a $560 billion economic partnership signed simultaneously by Canada, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the United Kingdom, covering energy, critical minerals, semiconductors, defense procurement, and a multilateral currency settlement mechanism that allows over $500 billion in annual trade to bypass the American financial system. The deal was negotiated in profound secrecy over 11 months, using communication protocols designed to evade American intelligence. It was signed before a single American official was briefed. Every retaliatory option assessed by the White House was determined to be ineffective or counterproductive. Warren Buffett explained why the deal represents something worse than a defeat. It's the moment the world learned to function without the United States. And once that lesson is learned, it cannot be unlearned. And Carney, standing at that podium at 3 o'clock in the morning, aimed 9 words at a sleeping capital that would hear them in the morning. The world doesn't stop because Washington is sleeping. Can the United States recapture markets that have been contractually committed to alternative suppliers for 15 years? Can American energy producers compete when the infrastructure that was supposed to make them Europe's primary supplier has been replaced by Canadian and Australian terminals financed by the customers themselves? Can the dollar maintain its settlement dominance when 6 allied democracies have built a parallel system specifically designed to operate without it? And the question no one in Washington can answer, the question the 3 a.m. timing made inescapable. If the world can build a $560 billion economic architecture without American knowledge, without American participation, and without waiting for American permission, what exactly is the argument that American centrality is still required? Trump tried to use economic pressure to make allies more dependent. Instead, he made them more determined to be independent. He tried to ensure that no major economic agreement could be signed without American participation. Instead, the largest multilateral economic deal of the century was signed while he slept. He tried to show the world that nothing happens without American approval. Instead, $560 billion happened at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the first American to know about it was a watch officer at the State Department who thought it was a mistake. And Carney gave that moment 9 words that will be remembered long after the trade war is forgotten. 9 words that every allied capital heard, that every foreign ministry understood, and that the morning sun carried into every window in Washington. The world doesn't stop because Washington is sleeping.